quote has something to do with how to build the society of the future, of which I like to think of us as citizens. Our theme for this year at the Still Moving Center as citizens of the future. One of the qualities I think of citizens of the future would be the ability to truly appreciate the great ones, and those maybe in the form of something in Buddhism that's called a bodhisattva. So this is the week of the Bodhisattva path, and to speak with us on that topic to get us started, we have Bob Buss, who was a professor at HPU of Religious Studies and who has practiced Mahayana Buddhism for decades. So Bob, I'd love to hand it over to you if I may.
Thank you. This topic is a little different for me. I basically took the idea of the Bodhisattva path and realized that this is the actual name of a famous Buddhist writing called the Bodhicharyavatara, which means the way of the Bodhisattva, a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, and more loosely, how to lead an awakened life. So it's a wonderful title. It's by Shantideva, which is from the early tradition of Mahayana Buddhism in India, actually the 8th century of India. And this is not a text I knew very well at all, but I thought, well, if I'm going to talk about the Bodhisattva path, this seems like an ideal place to begin. So I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. One is looking at Shantideva's work and giving some quotes from that source. And then part of the Bodhisattva path are the paramitas, or the perfections. And there are 5 or 6 of them. And the third one, Vira Paramita, is particularly important to the Bodhisattva path and is an entire chapter of the Shantideva's work. And so I'm going to look at that one paramita and then end by looking at the Bodhisattva path in everyday life. The Bodhisattva path is an interesting concept. It's something that I think is part of a lot of religious traditions. I've heard several talks here at GEMS that have referred to the Bodhisattva's path as part of theosophy, as part of other paths as well. And it's sort of an ideal that I think resonates well. And so I'm going to be presenting that not so much directly out of my practice, but just as an idea in Buddhism. And it really is a twofold work: how to develop an awakened mind and how to practice the Bodhisattva way. These are elements of the same. And as I was reading it, I just realized this is hopelessly idealistic, almost romantic. I mean, every day in Zen Buddhism, we chant the great vows. All beings are numerous, I vow to save them. How could anyone think that, to save all beings? And yet that's the core of the Bodhisattva path. So I hope to give you some flavor of how that's not only possible, but the only rational way to live. Shantideva is very homespun of saying living any other way is hopelessly painful. And so I'll begin with a quote from him from stanza, the 34th verse of the Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara. When neither existence nor non-existence remains before the mind, at that point, since there is no other position, mind rests in utter peace without any conceptualizing. And so fundamentally, the Bodhisattva path deals with the view of emptiness. All phenomena are empty of having an inherent nature. And that may sound abstract, but I think as we go through this, we're going to see that it's not only not abstract, it's a particularly vivid path to follow. And one way of looking at emptiness is to say that focus on the interdependent nature of what appears before, around, and indeed within us. We assume independent agency, me, mine, I, my body, my mind, my feelings, that is different from others. I am not you, you are not me. That's seemingly our starting point. According to Shantideva, when we see how things actually are, we have a better idea of how we should act. And his main idea is that that's not the way the world really is. My body, my thoughts, my actions. And that once we develop that wisdom of seeing how the world really is, and therefore knowing how to act, we will act from within the point of view of wisdom. And out of wisdom comes compassion. Basically, all suffering, ours and others, is interdependent. Also, it's impermanent. And also, it's empty of inherent nature. There is no use in drawing boundaries. And this is kind of a key of Shantideva. Correct understanding is itself prajna, or wisdom. And it's then countered with the seemingly solid, singular, imbued with agency element. So Shantideva says, all things then depend on other things, and these likewise depend. They are not independent. Knowing this, we will not be annoyed at things that are like magical appearances. Like bubbles, expanding now from that's a quote from Shantideva, but like magical appearances, it reminds me of the Diamond Sutra, which says that all phenomena are like magical appearances, like bubbles on the sea, flashes of lightning, very impermanent. Thus, when enemies or friends, this is Shantideva, thus when enemies or friends are seen to act improperly, remain serene and call to mind that everything arises from conditions. And most importantly, our own reactions arise from conditions. Our own reactions are equally not solid, not singular, not imbued with agency, but like a bubble on the sea, like a flash of lightning. And this is a new way of experiencing oneself in the world. The Dalai Lama has said that the Bodhisattva is his favorite religious work, and that it was formative for his spiritual development. Stepping back, we've all imagined that life somehow is more than it appears to be, that the difficult world we live in is not all there is, and that we ourselves are much more than we appear to be. In the Bodhisattva, Shantideva tells us that these hopes and dreams are not only worthy, but they can and must become real. The alternative, he says, is too grim to support. If we don't become bodhisattvas, saving all beings, altruistic, spiritual heroes, supermen, wonder women, we suffer terribly as small-minded, self-centered little beings, stressed out and unhappy. So we are told by Shantideva to throw off our limitations and enter the bodhisattva path. There is no other way. Bodhisattvas not only love all beings equally and work tirelessly for their well-being, they don't notice any obstacles. They also completely identify with beings, gathering their joys and sufferings into themselves. Bodhisattvas know that there is no self apart from others. Thich Nhat Hanh used to hold up a white piece of paper and say, "What do you see?" And, for adults, generally speaking, they would say, "Oh, I see a blank white sheet of paper. I see nothing. I see," it's very focused on that object that I'm holding in my hand. Little kids say, "Oh, I see a tree," because the paper came from a tree. And once you see a tree, you see clouds, you see rain, you see a forest. The tree itself is far away from paper. So somebody had to cut the tree down, a logger. Somebody had to go to a paper mill and do whatever it is that has to be done. Then it had to be made into paper. Then it had to be put into a store. Then I had to go and buy it. And on and on and on. This piece of paper contains everything, both our society and the rest of the world. It's interdependent. A few weeks ago, someone mentioned the net of Indra. Nothing stands by itself. In Zen practice, we chant the 4 Bodhisattva vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. It actually says, I vow to cut them off. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. Literally, I vow to embody it fully. I think of that and go, well, that's a bodhisattva, all right, but how could that possibly relate to me? And that's the crux of Shantideva's point. It's not about me. It's not ordinary time. It's not ordinary world, material world. It's about a spiritual, imaginative course that we are committed to. It's a vow, a way of life we live, come what may. And it's something we aspire to. The Bodhisattva way of life, the Bodhicharyavatara, is probably the greatest motivational text. And that leads me to the second part of the Bodhisattva path of the paramitas. Generally speaking, there are 5 of them. Mindfulness is a paramita, usually 2 paramitas. The dana paramita is generosity, giving. Sila is virtue or ethics. And so putting those together is the mindfulness of thoughts and conduct, the paramita of thoughts and conduct. The Kshanti Bodhisattva paramita is forbearance with difficulties. We basically say, well, this is my path, and what comes, comes, and I forbear the difficulties. Vira paramita is joyful effort that takes delight in every step of the way without worry about results. And the last 2 are dhyana paramita, or meditation, to stabilize the body and mind, and prajna, wisdom, that sees that the world is far otherwise than it appears. So the entire 7th chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara, the way of the Bodhisattva, is dedicated to vira, joyful effort. Shantidevi says it's like being moved, like trees and grasses being moved by the wind. This effort comes effortlessly. It is zeal, it is desire, it is the desire particularly to become a bodhisattva, to be a bodhisattva. It's the essential energy of the bodhisattva. The Dalai Lama has said that's the core, and Shantideva also said that's the core of the bodhisattva path, this joyful effort that doesn't cost us anything because there's no us paying it out. Bodhisattvas can never be defeated because they are not trying to win. Their goal is universal love and well-being, and it's unlimited. And therefore, vira, this joyful effort, is unlimited. Love is the only true sustaining motivation. And if we don't have that attitude, Shantideva says, we're basically limited and lazy. The lazy way of thinking is, this is my body, my mind, my world, my place to get to, my goal. Shantideva says, human life is a precious vessel, uniquely capable of crossing the stream of suffering to the shore of love and liberation. We all know this, but few of us take it to heart. Let's not waste this rare and precious opportunity, Shantideva says. Let's start right now to turn our boat around. Turning our boat around means not going towards me, but towards us, towards the world as interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it. Identifying myself with my body, my thoughts, my history, my feelings always has led to a painful dead end. And we need to look more carefully. And if we don't, we're being lazy. Shantideva says, and this is a beautiful quote, weird but beautiful. All the suffering there is in the world arises from wishing oneself to be happy. All the suffering there is in the world arises from wishing oneself to be happy. All the happiness there is in this world arises from our wishing others to be happy. That's the Bodhisattva path, of course. And having that attitude means that you basically accept, no, if I have cancer, I have cancer. I take life as it is. It's not that life is perfect. It's that I wish others to be happy. And we try to overcome our stuck habits, and oceans of joy will rush in. Bodhisattvas don't focus on difficulties or results, only steps in the endless path forward. And the step forward is not forward to a place, forward to nirvana, forward to heaven. Each step is itself the path. Thich Nhat Hanh once talked about not the idea of happiness as a project, but happiness as the path, the very path itself. And that leads me to my last point of the Bodhisattva in daily life. How in the world could you do that? Well, Vira Paramita has three parts. One is that you work on your character. You work on yourself. Work where you're stuck. Work where you have a point where this person is difficult. Okay, that's probably because I'm thinking of myself when I'm thinking of that person, and that person is doing something that I see in myself and I don't like it, therefore I don't like that person. That is one way of approaching the world, but there are other ways. And working on your character is one aspect of that. And then working on your spiritual practice. We meditate, we read spiritual books, we think about it, we practice spiritually. And then we begin to care about other people. This is what Renée called bodhicitta, or the reading that was given to you called bodhicitta, which is kind of a blend of wisdom and compassion working together. The Dhammapada, another early text, says, should you find a wise critic to point out your faults, follow him as you would a guide to hidden treasure. I remember a few weeks ago, we talked about Mara and saying to the Buddha, who had just been enlightened, what right do you have to teach? And the Buddha reaches down and touches the earth. And recently, I went to the Jodo temple because they have all the Boys' Day kites and flags of fish. And so we went there and I saw this statue, and rather than the Buddha sitting and just touching the earth, he was kneeling and touching the earth. And it struck me that it's not that the earth is witnessing Buddha's achievement or accomplishment. It's that the Buddha himself touches the earth, and that's the message, that's the teaching. This is a natural path. This is the natural way to be. The unnatural way to be is to think about me achieving something. And so what right do you have to preach anything? I don't have any right. I touch the earth. This is the earth's teaching itself. It's not unique to me. It's not my accomplishment. The Dhammapada says, if the mind is clear, whatever you do or say will bring happiness that will follow you like a shadow. And it strikes me that that could have come right out of Shantideva's Bodhicharya Vatara. I'll close with a quote from Suzuki Roshi, because Suzuki Roshi had this wonderful quote that said, "To give your sheep or cows a large, spacious meadow is the way to control them." Sheep and cows are your thoughts, your feelings, your attitudes, your mental formations, your ideas about yourself. And the way to control them is not to tightly grasp them and work through that in meditation or other places, but give them a wide meadow and simply take on the attitude of the Bodhisattva. Catherine of Siena was a Christian, and she said, "All the way to heaven is heaven." In the Bodhicharyavatara by Shantadevi, it says, "All the way to emptiness is emptiness. With each step, we arrive." Whether you're talking about the great vows, or the precepts, or the eightfold path of right mindfulness, right effort, the Dharma wheel, the paramitas of mindfulness, and all of those, the noble truths, the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. With the Bodhisattva ideal, the mind is poised for insight into the empty nature of all things. One of my favorite koans is, how does Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, use all those thousands of arms? And that's the path of the Bodhisattva. So that's it.
Wow.
Any questions arise in your mind?
Yeah, when do we start?
When do we start?
We've never stopped.
Yeah, people think of Zen and they think Zen is sitting meditation. And Zen is actually the attitude of the Bodhisattva vow of being a Bodhisattva. Zazen is sitting Zen. Kinhin is walking Zen. There's standing Zen. There's laying down Zen. When you go on a walk, you can sit down. Whatever position you're in is Zen, is an opportunity to practice. So when you lay down to go to bed, you can do lying down Zen. And there is a lying down Buddha. There is a sitting Buddha. There are standing Buddhas. There are walking Buddhas. The Bodhisattva path is such a wonderful attitude. And it struck me, I always thought, oh, it's so hopeless to think all beings, I'm going to liberate them and save them. But that only becomes impossible when it's me trying to do it. If I just say that is what I want, that is my aspiration, that is my goal. And every time I hit a snag, that's me working on my character or on my spiritual practice or on my attentiveness to others, being less selfish, being more spiritual, being more moral. I mean, that, like you say, that's our day-to-day life path, and it never ends. And Thich Nhat Hanh used to jokingly ask his students, he says, why is it no one has ever asked me if the Buddha meditated after his enlightenment? Because he knew they were all stuck in the Western view of, okay, he's reached enlightenment, that's it, he's there. And of course he's not there. The Buddha, in Zen, we sometimes say the Buddha is still himself only halfway there, because he's still got the other half of his life in front of him, whatever that is. Each step is the Bodhisattva path.
I don't have a question yet. I'm still working on one, but that was one of the most lucid, beautiful presentations I've heard on the Bodhisattva. I just want to thank you because it was just so illuminating and just so, it's just so lucid and clear. So I'm very much appreciative. I'm working on a question because it just seems to me that I mean, you mentioned earlier about it being kind of almost a romanticized version, romanticize. And I can understand that. because it's so easy to get lost. It's very subjective, because it's not in terms simply of rules and regulations, although there are rules and regulations, I realize, but he seems to be stressing the boundlessness of the subjective. And it's like the story of the two monks walking along the path. I think it's in Zen Buddhism, and they see there's an older monk and a younger monk, and the novitiate is watching. He admires greatly the older monk, and they come to a river, and there's a young woman, and it's just no, I think it's a great big puddle, and it's raining like mad. And so when they get near the woman, she's looking so distressed, and immediately the older monk goes and picks her up in his arms and walks her across this kind of swirling puddle and sets her down. And of course, the rule is you're not supposed to touch a member of the opposite sex. And so the novitiate, he's just puzzled, and he can't quite understand how this person he admires so much could just go do that. And so finally, at the end of the day, they come and they sit down, and finally the young monk cannot stand it any longer, and he just breaks out, sir, why did you pick up that woman? And the older monk looked at him and said, are you still carrying that woman?
Exactly right. Yeah, there are so many precepts, so many rules.
Yeah.
But Shantideva is very clear. They're all one. If you have, like on the Eightfold Path, the way to end suffering is to follow the Eightfold Path, the Noble Path, right view, right mindfulness, right effort, right livelihood. If you practice one, you're practicing them all. And you never practice them to get it. You practice it to be that. And Shantideva says, it's all about right view. It's not the little mind, it's the great mind. And that's entirely it.
I have a question there, though. Okay, say you take one of the Noble Eightfold Path, and you say, if you practice one, you practice all, right? But wouldn't that imply that you would have to uncover a number of misconceptions about what like right effort is, when you were talking about virya and so forth, so that to get to the depth of even one element or one step on the Noble Eightfold Path, wouldn't you, in a sense, have to unravel all the others simultaneously while you're trying to get the depth meaning, which goes beyond even concepts? But nonetheless, you would have to, by virtue of doing it, you have to kind of understand what is right view. And so you end up going through all of them. So to me, that's the sense in which if you master one, you really have mastered all. It's not like it just all happens at a magical moment, because by working through them, you actually have to confront all the others.
Yes. And I think the subtle point, and especially for Westerners, because we are very goal-oriented, we want to master it. We want to achieve it. And the point is, it's a path, so that we are working on each one in every path. And think of your own life. I mean, when I was working, everything that happened could trigger a bad view, a wrong view. I mean, right and wrong path, right, wrong path. And that's kind of built into it. And it's knowing, okay, that was a misstep. That wasn't the Bodhisattva's step. And I know why. And, then you keep going. And constantly, basically, in Buddhism, we say there are only three things to involve yourself: doing good, avoiding evil, saving all beings. They're all related. And when I make a mistake, it affects all beings, because I am no longer on the Bodhisattva path. I'm no longer practicing that, and I need to come back to it. And, it's a tricky thing, reaching enlightenment, because it's like that ignores the thing that there's something left. I love Catherine of Siena's point. Every step of the way to heaven is heaven. Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within you. Where do you have to go? It's such an obvious, it's a beautiful thing. Your essential nature, your Buddha nature is already there. You don't have to get it. And of course, what are we sitting? We're sitting to have Kensho awakening, and we are already Buddhas. This very place is the lotus land. This very body, the Buddha. That's Shantideva's point. But we don't know it, and therefore, yeah, we're going to have to work on it. We're going to have to carry that stuff with us until we see that it's not a point of obeying this law literally. And it was interesting. Thich Nhat Hanh changed all of the precepts from negative, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, not killing, to the positive end of that. One should not kill, which means one should cherish all life. Albert Schweitzer's thing of reverence for all life. That's the point of it. And of course, with that point of right view, we won't be killing. Or in a funny way, we will be killing. I mean, you can't help but kill. I'm a vegetarian, it doesn't matter. I still kill carrots. I still kill animals that were hurt in the making of farms that created the spinach I eat. I mean, you can't avoid the literal sense of killing, but you can have a reverence for life. And that changes things around a little. That saves all beings to have that reverential attitude.
Diana, thank you.
I just love that talk, Bob. Thank you so much. That was just beautiful. And I was really thinking, you made it very approachable, that you work on yourself, you work on your spiritual practice, and you care about other people. That's really a simplicity of living meditation or living enlightenment. Yes, we need seated meditation, but there is the living meditation, which you said. And one point that's not really talked about in Buddhism and in practice is joyful efforts. And, that we be mindful, that we have forbearance with difficulty, joyful effort, meditation, and wisdom. Joy is not as much talked about in the spiritual practice or in most religions. It's about letting go or denying the self or hurting the self or giving up of the self. But when there's an understanding of that peace and love and that oneness that we all experience, there is a sense of peace and joy underneath all the stuff that's going on. And it's like really living in the world and not of it, as Jesus said. But I really appreciated how you really brought in, and the other one was, all suffering there is in the world arises from wishing oneself to be happy. All the happiness in the world arises from wishing others to be happy. And we don't, talking about living from a place of joy in mindfulness and as the Bodhisattva, or living from the place of happiness. And there is a resting we do, in my words, in the divine or in God, that when we rest in that knowing, there is a peace and a joy, because we feel upheld and we're not alone, and we all are one, and we understand that. And there's a real sense of understanding that at a deeper level. So thank you. That was a beautiful talk.
Well, and that's the essence of it, really, is that that's the positive side. And the negative side is, of course, when I get stuck myself on me and my unhappiness and my knees hurting.
But that's why they call it a practice. The truth is, practice.
Right.
It's like we're practicing it. And the other side of that is when you said every step is the other shore, where we are right now is loved and by the divine and is one with everything at this exact moment. We may forget it for a moment and do things and get caught in I, but just like the breath in meditation, we come back to the breath, we come back to, and that's where I think compassion and forgiveness for self and others becomes really important.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny, not only does Buddhism not so much talk about that in many ways, but they also, in a sense, stress the opposite. I mean, when I was thinking of Buddhism, the idea of the Noble Truths is to cut off suffering, to not desire. So we want to cut off all those cravings and attachments that we have. But that joyful effort is just a big attachment. We want to be bodhisattvas. We desire it. And that's what moves us forward, is the desire to improve ourselves, to become closer to that bodhisattva ideal. And without that ardent desire, which is what another way of saying joyful effort, ardent desire, sincere wish, without that, we don't take the next step. I mean, it's funny. If you look at it, you say, well, in Buddhism, if you say there is no self, there is no Buddhism, let's all go take a nap. That's not the teaching. It's like, let's get going. Let's, if there is no Buddha and there is no self, let's start practicing. Let's be in this wonderful being with others. So it's a funny kind of, what a great desire, what a motivational thing. And Dalai Lama said, that's what kept me going. That's the point. When you get stuck, you just don't want to go on. You don't want to get out of bed. You don't want to, take any step. You're lethargic, and that's fighting your character that resists the Bodhisattva way of seeing the world. Seeing the world in a particular way means you'll want to act in a particular kind of way. I think this is when so many of you have talked about the Bodhisattva path within your own spiritual tradition, you're talking about kind of an energy that is there for your practice, even if it's not Buddhism or Zen or any of that specifically. I love Mother Teresa, who said, God never gives you anything that's too hard for you. And then she said, sometimes I wish he wouldn't trust me so much. And she does it playfully. It's like, you don't have to be all serious about it. You don't have to beat yourself up. It's just, okay, another step. I love the reference in Buddhism that there weren't statues of Buddha who was the enlightened one. In early Buddhism, there were footsteps. We were supposed to follow his example. That's all. It was not to achieve the state that he had achieved. It was to walk the path he discovered as the Bodhisattva way.
Thank you. And David, I see you have a question or comment.
Oh, probably a little bit of everything. Thank you, Bob. I concur with everybody else's comments. It was enlightening and delightfully digestible. It reminded me a couple of things. As has happened many times in GEMS, it coincides with my studies at school. So right now we're talking about the general systems theory and how it applies to the field of psychology, and how this whole idea that no man is an island, right? We share in everything, which was part of my meditation this morning about breathing with all these plants. I'm giving my CO2 to the plants so they can give me oxygen back. And that reciprocation is everywhere between all of us and everything all the time. But you also touched upon something that takes me back to the 80s when I did the Werner Erhard S training. And at the end of 60 grueling hours over 2 weekends, the thing that you get is that there's nothing to get. Right? And people say, we paid $450 to get that there's nothing to get, right? And it's the greatest gift that you could possibly get. Yeah, and this idea of turn the boat around, I often listen to Abraham Hicks. She's speaking the words of Abraham, and she says that, or he says, it says that the current of life is flowing on your behalf, and all we need to do is stop rowing against the current of life. The current itself will turn the boat around and take us downstream, which is that revelation that we are all part of this. Everything that we give out comes back to us, and vice versa. And we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And I think that this notion of joy is an evolutionary process. I wonder how happy cavemen were, I don't think happiness was really so much of an option when you're stuck in survival, but we are at the point where we see this interdependentness, and we've come to the realization that our happiness comes from giving. And so I think then, as you said, it's the source of true happiness.
Yeah. It's
thank-
an interesting way of thinking because, we can think of individual objects out there, atoms out there. We can also think of, as you say, systems and fields of energy, and that whole sense that it's all together. And it goes against a kind of Western way of thinking. It goes against the romantic view of myself, facing the great storm of life and a Wordsworthian element of being with the energy of nature, as opposed to really saying, I am that energy. John Muir used to climb to the top of a tree in the middle of a storm, and just there's no fear involved, just the pure energy of that place. And the Indian said, he's either a holy man or completely crazy, but he's a wonderful human being. I mean, it wasn't an indigenous way of thinking or anything. It was just a comfort, and just that was how he walked the path. And it's kind of an interesting thing because a lot of us, we're fearful. We're fearful of the dark. We're fearful of a snake. We're fearful of trees growing in on us, wilderness. We can be scared of a lot of things, and that means we're not comfortable with being that those are. It's not me being lost. It's me being with nature, as nature. It's kind of interesting. You reread things totally differently when you have that kind of view. And it's there, I think, in a lot of people's spiritual teachings that it's there. And there's a reason that we say only human beings can reach this. I mean, for animals and demons and hungry goats, it's too much. They can't work through that. And for angels and gods, they're already too happy. They can't move. It's hard enough for us. God never gives us more than we can handle, but it's a lot to handle, and that's why we have these talks.
Well, I was just thinking, I can see in a sense, the whole notion of happiness and joy being challenged in this way. In Christianity, you have John of the Cross, Saint John of the Cross, and the dark night of the soul, the feeling of abandonment, the trials one has to go through to really earn some kind of right relationship with God, that it's not just given because you believe in it. And furthermore, I can see, if you look at it from Buddhism and the logic of karma and reincarnation, but look at it's not only the suffering is inevitable in some sense, but to me, when we talking about, the more we talked about it, the more I thought of this. Well, take Shantideva. If you take what he's saying seriously, then what he seems to be saying is that the Bodhisattva path is the one path in which you renounce your happiness, even nirvanic bliss, because you identify with the suffering of others. Now, if you see a woman being forced to choose which of her children she wants to survive by a terrorist, and she has to go through the agony of choosing a child, this is a true story, and she has to choose which one of her children, and that doesn't move us to tears and suffering, then we're not on the Bodhisattva path. So the Bodhisattva is one who actually can see and witness increasingly the ignorance and suffering and perversity and ill will that exist in the world, but does not lose the perspective, even though they feel, in a sense, that pain to them is more real than their own. And so their commitment to help them, even though it's often without any seeming result, is what makes someone like Shantideva great. Because what we seem to forget is he suffered a great deal. It's not just a joyous philosophy, it's an earned joy. It's an earned bliss. And furthermore, it's renouncing it when it comes to you. That's why it's so difficult, because the temptation is when you have an opportunity of bliss, you usually take it. And what happens is we forget other people. And so to me, this is what the greatness of Shantideva is. He must have gone through a great deal to get to his position, and he must genuinely understand and sympathize greatly with the suffering of others to such a degree that he must suffer in his own way, very deeply, while at the same time he releases the radiance of joy. That's the paradox.
Yeah, it's interesting in the Bodhicharya Vatara. There are two verses that I speak to what you're speaking to. He said, because other people are happy, like me, I understand them. In other words, my desire for happiness is like their desire for happiness. So we are not different. We are not separate in that desire for happiness. And the next chapter, he talks about others are suffering, and they suffer as I suffer. And I am like them in that suffering. Maybe they're suffering, whatever their suffering is, I can identify it because I too have an element of suffering. That's me too. It's not just that I have the suffering and you have the suffering. We both suffer. We both have the desire for happiness and the aversion to suffering, the aversion to not suffering. And that gives us the energy to go on. And then, then you got to kind of take life as it comes. Some life is really, really hard. Natural disasters come, unnatural disasters come, wars happen. And obviously within that context, you see suffering 10 times, 100,000 times more than you yourself may have experienced. But Thich Nhat Hanh says, at that point, realize that every person, not just the boat people, but also the pirate that rapes the boat person, you have to realize that all of those beings are part of the interconnected world. And there, but for the grace of God, go I is kind of part of that. But a bigger part of it is this samsara is walking the path, whatever it is, and not drawing boundaries. You are wrong, you are evil, you should be hurt because you deserve it. You should be punished, you should be executed because of what you did. That is not the way of the Bodhisattva. Even though we think that way, oftentimes there's another way of thinking. And so I think it's not an easy thing at all, as you point out. It's tremendously challenging, but also the core is pretty simple. I suffer, therefore I am empathetic to others who suffer. I want happiness, therefore I am empathetic for the desire for happiness. That kind of keeps us going, and hopefully with some amount of joy, because that's what gives us the energy to take the next step.
So my question, I think it's one that I'd like to hear from, anybody in the room about just your thoughts on this. I may have expressed before at GEMS that sometimes when I have exceedingly difficult people in my life, and I think to myself, well, I don't really know who this person is. And maybe this is really a bodhisattva who has taken on this role for the sake of all the rest of us around this person who is suffering just being around this person because they're so difficult to be around. But maybe it's for our sake that that person has come into this lifetime with the different things that are going on with that person, just for our sake, to be able to learn something. And yet, this person seems to do things and say things that a bodhisattva would never do, would never say, in my view, right? And so I'm just wondering, is that possible, that someone who absolutely does not have what seem to be the virtues of a bodhisattva actually has come into our lives to serve a bodhisattvic purpose of helping us? So that's a question for everybody. And when we say bodhisattvic, I could also say Christ-like, right?
Could you re-ask the question in about 10 words?
Is it possible that someone is a bodhisattva in disguise who seems not to act like a bodhisattva at all, but they have come in to our orbit manifesting all kinds of different, difficult to be around, shall we say, traits, but they're doing it for our sake somehow?
Isn't there a statement in the Bible about Jesus out? Let him who is without sin throw the first stone. Remember when there's a woman who's accused of being a prostitute, and they want to judge her, and Christ comes in and said, and then eventually he doesn't say anything for quite a while, and he draws on the floor and so forth. And then when they look at Christ and try to challenge.
Jim, we heard that you were talking about the story from the Bible where
Let he who is without sin throw the first stone. Did you hear that?
Yes, we heard that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, all I was trying to say, but Jesus does one more thing. Jesus turns to the prostitute and say, leave and sin no more. It isn't just don't throw a stone unless you yourself are sinless, but he also says something to her. He said, go forth and sin no more. He's not saying that she should be a prostitute, that just because you don't judge her actions, she's accountable for them. They all generate karma. And if she's doing that, we can say we don't know the soul. They're absolutely true, but we can hold people accountable for their actions because their actions hurt people and help people.
Yeah.
He didn't specify
wonderful.
suffering was the sin either.
There's a wonderful sense where the Bodhisattva path is very close to the idea of parables, living your life by parables. All of them, the Good Samaritan. In a way, as Renée points out, there are people out there that just seem to be difficult for us to deal with, and that's why we're here. Samsara, this world, is for us to walk through, and we don't meet anyone by accident. It's all wrapped up in our karma, and because we're dealing with them, that's the sort of stage that we are seeing the world as a bodhisattva. And that's kind of the trick. When you look out, how do you see it as a bodhisattva? That will help you act as a bodhisattva. First, you have to see the world that way. If you see the world as me versus them, I'm good, they're bad, then you're kind of trapped. And that's going to make it very difficult for you to see the world as the bodhisattva sees it. Bodhisattva hears the cries of the world. Do you hear them? She's coming to you. Are you coming to her? The bodhisattva is a unique way of looking at what you encounter, which can be indeed very heavy.
Thank you.
Well, I think for a human being of what you're raising, for him to be even masquerading or very deliberately doing challenging things, he would have to have his higher nature developed. So he would have to be rooted in something high and good, and then so that would be an ultimate control over what he might do that's provocative in relations with human beings. And I don't think that would enable him, or he or she to be cruel or in some way kind of break down others. He would find ways of provoking and drawing out reactions that might be instructive to us, but there would be a platform of control. So that's just my thought on that. And then it just is that there are people who are completely lost. We read about that and all, completely lost and completely enmeshed in evil. But even, there's the notes of the Bhagavad Gita. It's pointed out that maybe a very high soul could be really at the bottom, you might say, of the human ladder, but is very possible for them to rise to a point of enlightened conduct. So your question I think has merit, but always remember that there has to be, for that kind of control and deliberate provocation, there has to be some conscious developed awareness of proper conduct. That would be my view.
Yes, I guess I'm wondering whether we can judge whether or not that individual actually does. And I'm also thinking of Whitman, who's, identifying himself in some ways with Christ, and also George William Russell and his poem about, someone getting thrown out the tavern door, and yet that is the Prince of Peace. And Walt Whitman talks about raging in my insane crisis. And so there's just this sense of mystery, I think, and that we can't necessarily ever know, maybe from the outside, the spiritual stature of another, and what role they're really playing. I'm just proposing it as a possibility, seeing what people think. Anne, do you mind if I call on you? And we're at the top of our hour, and if all you'd like to do is give us a gratitude, that's great too. But if you have any comments you'd like to make, that would be wonderful.
My gratitude. I'm very grateful for today's talk, Bus. Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. And it just reminded me of why I had this sudden urge to visit temples recently in the past 2 months. And what comes to my mind is I visited a temple in Nara called Hasedera, and it had like 300, almost 400 stairs going up to the temple. And now I know what I felt. At that time, I know I felt good, but when you mentioned letting go, so each step I took up to that temple, I felt better and better. So I kind of know why I felt better, because you said one of the three aspects was letting go. So I was letting go. And by the time I reached the temple, I felt like a little bit like a different person. I'm a little more like I was stuck probably, and I felt more open. And the Buddhist statue was a standing statue. And so we could rub the feet of the Buddha. And I found that although I couldn't understand what everything was or what type of Buddha sculpture it was, it somehow made me feel, I don't know, like energy or something, and just like I could go forward. Or so you mentioned standing on the ground, touching the earth. So that meant a lot to me. I could associate with that. So thank you very much.
No.
That's Vera. That's that energy. That's what allows us to move on. Is experience it exactly as you experienced it.
Yeah. Well, Bob, we all do want to thank you so much. That was such really a joyful and uplifting presentation for us to hear. And it just emanates out of your very being. It was like seeping out your pores. I felt such an uplift in listening to you speak today. Just great thanks.
Thank you all.
I want to let you know that next week we're going to have a real treat. One of our favorite speakers, I think, over the years at GEMS has been Miku Lenentine. And she's one of the few people that I've ever allowed at Still and Moving Center to lead people in guided meditations. And I just have this deep kind of trust in her. I'll just leave it there. And she is next week going to take up the topic of honoring wisdom keepers. Honoring wisdom keepers. And she'll do it from different indigenous traditions and possibly even the indigenous traditions of England and Ireland. So very unusual in some of the ways that she approaches things. Plus Native American, South American, she's got quite a vast range of wisdom traditions that she has studied, gotten personal guidance in these different traditions. So that should be another real treat for us. And just not to jump ahead, just really want to share that debt of gratitude to you today for what you shared with us, Bob. Really wonderful. Right. Kevin, did you have anything that you didn't get a chance to say today? I saw you so engaged.
No, I just really enjoyed the section about me instead of inclusive, because I feel like right now, especially all throughout the nation, there is such a chaos, I guess. I just was thinking about the recent terminations, I guess, of two very prominent news figures on two different networks. And it's just interesting to hear all the comments on both sides, whether it was for or against. And I think that sometimes, especially in the mainstream media, these people forget that they are not, they're supposed to be including and educating rather than trying to steer one in a certain bias. And it just really was a great talk, Bob. It's always great to hear from your perspective. And I really think everybody really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Kevin, coming from a, I think initially Catholic perspective, over the course of this GEMS and the different talks such as Bob's, has your outlook changed in any way?
Yes, before Still a Moving Center, I didn't really have a lot of exposure to Buddhism or many different, traditions. And I think that as I continue on, not even just with Still a Moving, but I have grown to appreciate and really take a look from a different angle. So while my grandparents might not be too proud of that because it was like drilled into my head, I think that in order to be a worldly person and just constantly doing that lifelong learning, you can never reach your highest potential unless you expose yourself to many different viewpoints. And this is definitely an interesting one.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so wonderful that we have Mary, who's such a devoted Catholic, and goes to mass weekly and goes to Catholic retreats, and so steadily attends GEMS. Like,
Mhm.
I think that's the true Catholic perspective, because Catholic, Bob, isn't there something about Catholic actually meaning something like a breadth of perspective?
Well, that's its original meaning. Is Catholic means we're all together, as opposed to, in a sense, the Protestant energy is to take away from that. But Catholic is a unifying by its very nature.
Mhm. Thank you. I've been wondering about that for quite some time, so I wanted to ask a religious studies professor about that.
And part of it is the way language works. I mean, the word Catholic is itself a word. It doesn't have to be part of religion. And just as a Protestant is one who protests, a Catholic is one who is uniting, caring about everyone. So it's interesting that the idea of the Vira Paramita can be seen as kind of being a spiritual warrior. It's where we get it. Vira is where we get the word virality, virile nature. And being a warrior means you're willing to kind of step out there and do this sort of thing. And I think that's really common to a lot of religions. You look at the energy that a person like Paul or a teacher like St. Augustine, I mean, all of them they had a great inner desire to communicate and to help people. I mean, and I think you get that energy from Jesus in the parables of really, this is for your benefit. If you could get this, and sometimes the parables are really tough. The parables don't make a lot of sense. There's one parable that is very difficult for the Western mind. And it's basically that the parable is, if you're working all day, then you get paid for your day's work. If you come halfway through the day, you also get paid for a day's work. If you work for 3 hours, you get paid for a day's work. If you work for half hour, you get paid for a day's work. And they came to the owner and said, this is not fair. And he said, well, you're being paid for a day's work. You can't complain. And nor should you complain that I'm being generous to the other people. It's not about fairness. It's working, receiving, giving. All of the elements of being spiritual have nothing to do with how much money passes between hands. But that parable is very difficult, that Kevin only works an hour, but I worked all day and we get paid the same. And Jesus is saying, well, take the next step and say, great.
Get over it.
Partly it, yeah.
There's a similar one, and maybe it's the same, but the unjust steward, where is the management or something is taken away, and one of the sons has to beg. That one was a difficult one for me to follow as well. But I think that the more you explore them, the greater the better.
Especially for the son who stayed.
Yes.
And did his job and did his work, and he didn't waste his inheritance.
Right.
And father's just saying, my son is returned, give a fatted calf. Where's my fatted calf? I've been here working the whole time. You're right. It's very hard. Right. And as Renée says, get over it. Somehow get over yourself and why you think it's unfair to celebrate a son returning, unfair to celebrate someone's work, to celebrate someone who is a person and should sin no more. But nevertheless, you don't get to throw the first stone.
Right.
Well, thank you both so much.
Thank
And
you.
I really thank you, Bob, on behalf of everybody that we think was listening, and all the beings in the universe who actually were listening that we don't even, see or necessarily know about, yet we have an intuition that they were there.
Thank you.
And Kevin, thank you as always for just really servicing this so well.